Okay, I think we will start. If you could find your seat as quickly as possible. Lots of seats up at the back, because I want to give as much time as possible. As I was saying, this is one of the highlights of the conference, I think, for me, because we are welcoming our colleague from New Zealand, and she has come specially from New Zealand to speak to us. And I think we've tried a few years, and finally we have you here between COVID and various other things. And it's a particular delight to welcome Linda to the BERA Conference 2023. Linda is an educator, she's a scholar, she's a writer and a mentor. She's known for her work on decolonializing research methodologies, Indigenous education, and I hope I'm going to say this properly, Kaupapa Maori. I've been practicing. I asked a friend to help me with this. And she currently leads a newly established research Kai, or Food Institute, that focuses on revitalizing Maori knowledge and on Kai sovereignty and security. She's a fellow of the American Education Research Association, a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and an honorary international member of the American Academy of Arts and Scientists. On a personal note, you know, every so often, maybe it's only occasionally, but occasionally you read a book that actually makes you see the world in a different way. And just if I can put a personal note in here, when I read Professor Smith's book, it just made me see the world in a different way. And I think that's a very special thing. Linda's, or Distinguished Professor Smith's, current research spans intergenerational trauma, Crown and government engagement frameworks with Maori, and food sovereignty. And therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Linda Smith now to speak to us.
Tēnā koutou katoa, greetings from the south side of Mother Earth. It's a long way here, and I still haven't got my sleep patterns. I've been up since about 3 a.m. And after this, I know I'm going to sleep well. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I was invited, but COVID interrupted that. And I know COVID has had a huge impact all around the world. And in New Zealand, we were very well sheltered from the first wave of COVID. But it meant we were stuck at home. And that's a good thing, and then it's a suffocating thing. And so this year, I've been travelling the world. Everything has been in person, but I see the world differently because of being locked up at home. And I say that as a Māori person from New Zealand, because we are navigators, we are travellers, we love to travel. And right now, I know there are a lot of Māori people in France, because there's a certain sport on that I don't like, but my husband loves it. There's a whole lot in Canada because there's another huge conference, and there are family members all over the place. But it's a pleasure to be here in Birmingham. I've not been here before, nor have I been to a BERA conference, so it's a pleasure to be here with you. I want to start off. Basically, what I'm going to talk about in terms of decolonising is a long game intergenerational story. Colonisation really impacted different peoples in different ways, different destructive ways, but usually in a generation killed something. Usually in a generation destroyed something. And the work of decolonising is an intergenerational job. So while it might take one generation to kill a language, to kill a leadership, to kill relationships to land, it takes 5, 10, 20 generations to recover a language, to recover connections, to recover sovereignty. And I've spent about 50 years of my own life thinking about decolonising, trying to figure it out, trying to be active in it, trying to do something about it. And I'd love to say I've got some really profound things to say, other than it's damn hard work. To me, it's not simply a theory of decolonising or a theory of how colonisation worked. It's also a practice and a pedagogy. It's about trying to disentangle something that is so entangled that it is in our minds, is in our emotions, in our language, it's in our relationships. It's in the systems we engage with. It's in everyday practices. It's in what happens when you walk outside your door and when you walk back into your home. It is deep and difficult to deal with. These photos here are my family. The main photo is the one on your left, because I am a great-grandmother. So that's fantastic. But what I really want to illustrate is 5 generations can live concurrently. And if you think about 5 generations, that spans 100 years. My father is 96. He still works. He's a professor, and he founded the institution that I work in. And he's a cultural authority on Māori culture. Why is that important? Because when I look backwards, I see my great-grandmother. She's the one with the moko kauai on the left, and my great-great-grandmother who's above her, and my great-great-grandfather who's been arrested by the constabulary. And on the top right, in there is a Scottish great-grandfather. And down in the other black and white photo is an English great-grandfather. And on the mantelpiece, it's my grandmother and my aunts. My grandmother lived till she was 98. My aunts have lived into their 90s. My great-grandmother lived till she was 106. So when I say we can span 100 years and 5 generations in my family, we can. In the middle, my parents. My mum died, fortunately, before COVID. But as I said, my father is still a working professor who's just finished a manuscript on Māori knowledge. So colonialism for us in New Zealand and Aotearoa, for Māori, was not that long ago, right? Of all the countries, New Zealand was one of the last parts of the world that the British, I don't even know if they wanted New Zealand, but they got there, and for a lot of complex reasons, ended up signing a treaty. And that changed the trajectory and the future of my ancestors. So I guess my job as an educator, and actually as a student, as a university student, was to figure out how to change the future, because we couldn't change the past. How to make the past make sense for us so that there was some hope for us to live into the future. How to take rage from our communities and turn it into something positive and hopeful. So I started out as a student activist when I was a university student in one of the many activist groups of the 1970s. Like, there were heaps on campus. And I chose not to be with this group and not to be with that group, but to be with a particular group called Ngā Tamatoa, who were considered one of the most radical Māori activist groups of the time. We had three aims. One was the honouring of the Treaty of Waitangi. Third one was the restoration of our language. Actually, it was to have our language taught in school. And the other one was the idea of tino rangatiratanga, our sovereignty, and of reclaiming that. And of course, we were hated, not just by non-Māori, but by our own families, because we were seen as disruptive. And they taught me a lot of lessons about what it means to change society, what it means to develop, as Eve Tuck says, a theory of change. Because when you're in that mode of change, you're going to upset a lot of people. And some of those people are people you love. And some of those people are people who you know love you. So the work of decolonising is very human work. It's very emotional. It can make you give up, and it can make you go forward. So what I'm really going to talk about today then are some learnings, some things to think about, some things I think we can celebrate, some ways to position what we do as educational researchers in terms of our practice. Before I do that though, I just want to talk to those of you who might be students here and who are presenting at BERA for the first time. Earlier today I was talking to my husband, and both of us were employed 0.5 in one job at the University of Auckland. And we were also instructed to do our PhDs. And we had another colleague, and we had a panel at the NZARE. We still argue about who took up all the time. And both the men say it was me. But they had first dibs. So all I'm saying for those of you who are presenting, who are students, that's awesome. I still have the papers that I presented at my first NZARE, because like a good student, I wrote every word out in full and I read every word out in full, because I was so nervous that I would go haywire and wouldn't be able to answer any questions, so I made sure to fill up all the time as well. I was terrified of questions. So there's hope. Okay, so in these slides, there's me in my first school. I was taught by my parents. My parents were teachers in the Māori school system, which was a separate school system started in 1864. The New Zealand government set up what was called the Native School System, 1867, and it predated the Education Act. The purpose of the Māori school system was basically cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation means cultural destruction, all right? but it sort of had a twist in our context. Our context is very different from Canada and Australia. So in our context, these were village day schools, and the people, the tribe or the community, had to provide the land for the school. They had to write a letter of support. They had to be the school committee, and they had to collect firewood for the head teacher. Māori embraced the school system at that time in the 1860s for good reason, because it was also at that time that Māori lands were being invaded and were being taken, also under a raft of legislation around land ownership, the privatisation of land and the forced selling of land. It was a desperate period. My grandmother was one of those who set up a Māori school. It was down the road from our valley, and my uncles and aunts went to that school. My parents trained as teachers in the Māori school system. The word native changed to Māori after World War II. So that's, I'll leave you to guess which one I am, but in the top. And down the bottom, I'm the teacher. That's my first class. And I don't know how many of you are practicing teachers. They taught me everything I needed to know, even to teach at university level. They were an interesting group of urban Māori Pacific intermediate age, 11, 12-year-olds. We were a fast-growing school in an urban area in Auckland. We had no resources. My students were the best hunter-gatherers you can imagine. And every Monday morning, we had resources. And I learned not to ask where they came from. But just in that period of time, from the Māori school system, and I went to that as a student, and then into the urban school system, there were great changes. On the right of the picture, though, is a different story. And that story is about our language revival. And on the top right is a school, an alternative Māori school that we developed. We were part of the community that created what's called kura kaupapa Māori. These schools were created in the 1980s because we as parents were not satisfied with what mainstream schools were offering. So our solution to that was, okay, if you cannot meet our needs, we'll meet them ourselves. So we went hunting for a classroom, and we found one at Auckland Teachers College, and they gave us a room for 15 students. My husband took leave, and he was a lecturer by then at the Teachers College, but he took leave to start our first kura. Those children are now in their 40s, or late 30s, early 40s. And on the bottom right is the institution that I'm currently at, Te Whare Wānanga o Awanui Ārangi, also started about 30, 40 years ago. As I said, my father was the founder of that, and our tribe. So our tribe decided that there was no institution meeting the needs of our people, and we're going to have to do this ourselves. Now, the reason I show those is the decolonising work, to me, is not simply about trying to transform existing institutions, existing everythings. It is also about trying to create new things, new ideas, new institutions, new ways of organising, new curriculum, you name it. but trying to do that independently of the systems that exist. In my career, I've worked across both. I've created and helped create alternative schools and what we call wānanga. Our wānanga teachers to PhD level. It's an accredited PhD institution with master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, and a whole range of adult education, community education. There are learnings to be found in trying to do things independently. So some people have the romantic idea you throw it all out, right? And you start from scratch. Well, we know from our schooling experience, and we also know from our tertiary university experience, it's really hard to start from scratch. In fact, it's impossible, because you'd have to blank your entire life experience out and the experiences of the parents who bring you their children. One example of this, we'd set up our radical different school. We had a meeting one night and a parent asked why we didn't have a bell. And we thought, what do you want a bell for? So, so we could be like another school. We could be like a real school. So those things popped up all the time, that parents wanted something different, but they wanted it to smell the same, feel the same, look the same. And that's often the challenge that we're working in, that people can't step into a blank space. It's too tough. There has to be some kind of structure there. And the structure that's there is a sort of version of what we'd left behind. It had walls, it had a roof, it looked like a classroom. Over time, teachers wanted things that other teachers had, and that included a staff room. And over time, the Labour Department wanted regulations around toilets, really important things, and around volunteers working, health and safety. And so bit by bit, that radical idea gets constrained. And we start having to create our alternative inside what are often invisible walls. We might know that as hegemony or ideology, but they're walls nevertheless that you have to confront. So knowing that, I want to think about some of those experiences around what it means then to decolonise education research. So when I started as a graduate student, I was obsessed with theory and method, because that's what I thought it was about. And I loved it. I thought, yep, this is the world. I could see the light. It's going to be about those things. And then, as I learned, I had to do some research. I had to actually design a project, and I had to enact it, carry it out. And in the process of reading and thinking about things, really that is what drove me in the end to write Decolonising methodologies, because I couldn't see myself in the literature. I mean, let's face it, research methods books in bookshops are the most boring section of a bookshop ever. And there were no books in there, and no books in the library that flipped what it meant to actually be an Indigenous person for a start off, but an Indigenous researcher. All the literature that was there was written by non-Indigenous people about us. And it was horrible. You know, it's what caused outrage. It's like, this is crap. How can they have written this? This is racist. Right, but that was insufficient. What was the lesson in there to learn as a researcher? To not make moral judgments, to maybe not even go and visit other people's. But it wasn't the lessons that I needed to make me a researcher. And so I had to stumble around. And I stumbled around in a range of sort of theories and methods. Stumbled around feminism, butted up against what was white feminism, and then sort of found joy in black feminism, but then it wasn't Indigenous feminism, and found joy in African American feminism, and went to the bookshops, and they were all on the bottom shelf. And I looked and looked and looked, and we weren't there. And yet, in my life, as I was moving around communities and travelling, I heard the story of research. And in every Indigenous community I've ever been to, this is the mantra. We are the most researched people in the world. Have many of you heard that statement? We are the most researched people in the world. And I started to think, what does that mean? They can't all be the most researched people in the world. But what does it mean for a community to say that, to make that statement? What are they saying about how they feel about research? What are they saying about their view of a researcher and of research? And what does it mean then for me as a graduate student trying to enter that domain and not be like that? What do I have to redesign? Is it the method? Is it the theory? Is it the view? Is it the question? Is it me? Is it ethics? All those questions, I think, is really what I've had to explore. But as I've matured as a researcher and matured as a scholar and gone on to other things, that part of it, methods and theory, that to me that's almost the end of the chain. It's the institution of knowledge that's important, that research dwells in. That's important. So if we're to decolonise educational research, we need to understand what kind of institution is it, this educational research? What are its structures? What structures does it get its power from and feed from? How much of that is, theoretical academic structures? But how much of that is also the economy that feeds the way knowledge is understood these days? How much is it about political structure and social structure? How much is it about the systems that have been designed to support research, to train researchers, to accredit researchers, to fund research, to assess research? All of those systems are part of this institution as a powerful system. One of the things I've done quite deliberately in my career is become an assessor, get interested in the management of research. I've been a director of a Centre of Research Excellence. I've been on the Health Research Council Governance Board. I've chaired the Māori Health Research Committee. I've been on the Marsden Fund Board. So I've had a big role to play in the system of research. And, you know, when you're a student, you're probably thinking, power is right at the top. Well, you get at the top, you get to the top, and you're still wondering where the power is. Right? Because everyone at the top is saying, we don't have much power to make decisions. So then you get a different view of power, right? That power is distributed across this institution, and it works in both overt and subversive ways, invisible and invisible ways. Power is in individuals, but it's in systems. Power is in the detail of minutes, of agenda papers, of budgets, of policies, of the culture of people who do that work. So it isn't just, you know, there isn't a golden, sorry if you had hope that, you know, there was this golden place where power lies, but it doesn't, it's distributed. So the work of decolonising education research is the systematic scrutiny of what we're talking about, what needs to change, what are the foundations of it, what are its boundaries, right? Where is the parts where people get anxious or people make rules? No, you know, that's not education, that's not research. We don't do that. We did that last time, we tried, it didn't work, so we're never going to do it ever again. It's about the way we train people. But it's even in the administration of research. I mean, anyone who's in a bureaucracy, who's had a research grant, who's tried to get money out of it, to pay community people travel for their time. See, I can hear people laughing already. You know what I mean. Administrators are very powerful because they hold the key to your funding. But also measurement tools. These days, that also includes algorithms. It includes formulas. It includes the things that, you know, as a mainly qualitative researcher, I don't really want to be interested in, but I've had to become interested in because inside those measurement tools are qualities, characteristics, assumptions, and results that are loaded, that are often racist, that are of no value if we're wanting to decolonise our systems. So this is a lot of work to do. And I guess the main point I'm making is one person cannot decolonise this system, nor can 100. Nor can all of this be done today. It is an intergenerational job. That's why I say it's intergenerational. And if I look at the evolution in New Zealand, you can see very clearly, you know, 30 years ago, we could not have imagined what we see now in our system. 30 years ago. It was a dream. And it was a dream that many people rubbished us for, because, oh, that'll never happen. The British Museum will never give anything back to you. You know, museums will never do this. You'll never get your human remains back. Well, ha, 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 ha. 30 years on, because people have held that vision and have worked systematically, purposefully, with detail, with determination, and things have changed. So don't get disheartened if they don't change in a year. When I started in, you know, my first conference at NZARE, it was all white men. Well, 99% white men. They were the committee, they had all the power, they did all the keynotes, they did all the talks. You know, as a woman, you really had to be able to talk rugby, and I couldn't, and I didn't really want to. So, you know, the 5-10 women who were at the conference were basically talking to ourselves. They even planned the dinner, and it always suited them because they were big drinkers. And for those of us who didn't really indulge, we didn't even want to go to dinner. That was 30 years ago, or that was 40 years ago for me. It's completely different. And it's not different by accident, right? It's different by design, because people wanted to change that. Women now dominate educational research in New Zealand, right? It's not that our committees are all women. The diversity issue for us has not just been about gender. It's also about being Māori, having a treaty relationship. That's one of the unique things about New Zealand, is this expectation that institutions will have a treaty relationship. And that means their relationship to Māori is on a different basis, a more constitutional basis than a relationship to diverse other groups, minority groups. So, you know, that's been, once again, part of the struggle for our sovereignty and our self-determination. So I hope you don't feel tired. Everything on that list, I know over my career I've tried to do something about. And each of you can do that as well. Next time you're having an argument with the administration, you have to think about, this needs decolonising, and try to think about what actually has to be done. Because it's not just about dismantling something, right? What's the alternative? How can you change that so that everyone still gains? The greatest fear for many people when you mention the word decolonising is someone's going to miss out. People are frightened. Things that they struggled for are going to disappear. Well, what do you think colonialism was about? What do you think colonisation was about? People did miss out, big time. What's different, I think, what we've learned about decolonising is to go forward, it has to be much more collaborative. It's not good enough just to flip things around so a different group misses out. What we've got to try and do is design a system where everyone can be their best selves. And that's hard, because it actually takes generosity. It takes a generosity that was not shown to people who were colonised. It takes compassion, it takes courage, it takes patience. And it takes an awful amount of leadership from both allies and people who are on the front line. So if you're thinking about this organisation, I'm not going to give you advice, but I think it's not simply, education research isn't simply about this organisation, right? It's about how universities train researchers. It's about the funding of research. It's about the policies at national government level all the way down to local level. It's about the role of practitioners and teachers and schools, of other institutions, of communities, and trying to imagine their role in research. I mean, do we ever ask communities about educational research and what they would like research to do? Do we ever ask them? We might ask schools, we might ask other educators, but do we ever ask other publics about what that might look like? So anything where the word decolonise is often used, as I said, creates anxiety. And one of the reasons for that is because it will shift relations of power by definition. Those relations have to change. And it isn't simply about, in my context, putting more Māori people on a committee. I've been, on committees as the one Māori and one woman on academic committees. That's not a change, all right? That's a seat at a table still dominated by a culture, by systems and policies. It's an opportunity, but it's not a structural change. When the entire table changes and everyone around that table looks different, that might represent a structural change. So, in the end, I think a lot of this is about thinking around the future, about educating the next generation for the worlds that they're going to face, and a world that we won't be in. So if I go back to my photo of 5 generations of my family, and I know when I look backwards at my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather, I know what they tried to do to make my life better. We know that through our oral histories. We know that because they actually did write things down and left a legacy for us. I know what my grandparents did to make life better. One of the things they did was to actually believe in education. To believe not only that the boys should be educated, but that the girls should be educated. So for my mother and her sisters were all sent away to boarding school for that reason, that my grandparents believed. And it's partly a mix of having a Scottish and English sort of great-grandfathers in that mix, but also a story about land. So in our family tradition, but it's also a proverb, is if you want to hold the land, you give it to the women. All right, you give it to the women. Why? Because descent will flow through the women. The men could have one woman over here, and then they could run away and get another woman. And they could bring those children back here. And that's not how our land tenure works. It works genealogically through the women. And so my grandparents believed educating the women was the future. The brothers went to school as well, but were brought home to run the farm. And then half of them volunteered to go to war as well. So that was a commitment my family made to education. Other families made different commitments. Some committed, for example, to the church. Some were alienated from those systems. So on my dad's side is a story of alienation, of distrust of education. And one of our greatest leaders on that side said, don't trust education, it's the work of Satan. That was the message on that side. And that's because that leader linked it very much to the destruction of our lands and culture. So on different sides of me are different kinds of commitments. So I'm going to have to race because my alarm's just gone off. So I think these thoughts here really about, how do we create different spaces, different opportunities, different subjectivities, different kinds of humans for the future when we're stuck in where we're at, right? With all the baggage that we have from the past, how do we clear spaces for new generations to do different things? And the way we speak about it at home, we talk about that as a healing process. So decolonising also has to be healing, right? It has to heal because the trauma of colonisation has just been carried down and down. And we see that trauma in our social circumstances. And we don't want that to be the legacy for 2 more generations. Do they inherit that trauma? And another generation, do they inherit it? So the strategies that we build have to be peaceful, compassionate, kind, and healing. And that healing is not about individuals, it is about them, but it is about the collective, about communities. So what does it mean then to reimagine? So I think the act of decolonising is an act of reimagining. Like, why begin it if you haven't got an imagination about what you will achieve? And that's a complex imagination because it's partial, right? It's like imagine something that's not complete. It's maybe not filled in. Some people like it to be fully fleshed out before they'll take the first step. But the whole point, I think, of a decolonising process is it has to be imagined by a collective. I can't imagine what decolonising looks for here in this context, or for Australia, or for Canada. I can barely imagine it in my own context. I'm just one of many who has to do this kind of visioning work and thinking work. So if I go back to the schools we started, we did have one really clear idea about the future. And that is that we would create different kinds of children. And the reason we thought that was because we were seeing our children coming out of state schools angry, outraged, violent, disrespectful, rude, unemployable, no qualifications, no sense of success. We didn't want that. We wanted children who were joyful, who could speak our language, who had a strong identity, who were open to knowledge, who could learn, who believed they had the power to learn. So we did have that clear idea. And I think if you think about that as a practical example, then what does it mean to imagine a decolonised world? It has to be, we produce different kinds of people, different kinds of relationships, different kinds of connections. And that also means different kinds of institutions, different ways of doing things, different ways of relating. And that work has to be done in discussion and dialogue and at community level. It's not a top-down exercise. The moment it comes top-down, I know at home everyone go, oh, same old colonising rubbish. You know, we have to do it differently. And we have to imagine these things. And we will get things wrong. There's another lesson from our school system, our alternative school. You do not learn if you don't make a mistake. What's important when you make a mistake is to pause, analyse why it went wrong, and pose a different solution. When you can become problem solvers, you're stronger. You're stronger. When you can analyse a problem, solve a problem, you're stronger for that. So we have to kind of be prepared ourselves to be different. And that's really difficult. It's very hard for people who've been trained to be experts, for example, in our field, and then to sit with people who are not experts in our field and listen to them give us feedback. I mean, at the moment at home, I've been asked to be a mentor to an assessing committee, none of whom are researchers. They are community leaders, business leaders, stakeholder leaders, and they're going to be assessing research. And I'm thinking, okay, all right, I'll have to get my head around what that means. But it's a definite shift from us assessing ourselves. And a lot of that you will recognise when I use the word impact, that, you know, much of this has been driven by research expected to have an impact with stakeholder communities. So there's a whole sort of neoliberal sort of performance part in there. But I think the other thing about being prepared to be different is to kind of unlearn what we ourselves have learned as researchers. To learn to do our work differently and to be brave about that. To learn sometimes to step aside. Right, to not be the leader. To train new leaders. I mean, I became a good researcher because I was trained by great researchers. And actually my first training was in health, not in education. And in health I had to sit around with a whole lot of specialists, you know, the hierarchy of health, and I went like that all the way down to me. Everyone wore different coloured sort of labels because we were in a hospital. We had heart surgeons, respiratory physicians, all the way down to technicians, and researchers had no identity whatsoever. It was the most powerful position to be in. All right, I had a little label with no colour on it. And I could go anywhere in the hospital, like literally. And my job was to look at records and to access people's numbers and ring them up and go and visit them and that. But what I learned is the power of being invisible as opposed to being disempowered by invisibility. And that was another thing that's really important. So unlearning things is important. And then reimagining what that means for our agenda, our priorities, you know, our practices. Is what we're all doing really, really important to the world, to the future, to next generations? Is it the best that we ourselves could be doing? Is it what we should be doing as opposed to maybe what someone else could be doing? Is there a way to distribute that work? There's a lot of questions, and I don't have the answers for you. But I know it's worth asking those questions. I know it's worth trying to imagine something differently, because if we can't do that, all we will do is reproduce the status quo. And sometimes in reproducing the status quo, we make it worse than what it is, because we don't change it. We just over-regulate it. We don't open the doors to different possibilities. We start to close the doors. We start to narrow. And I think that's always dangerous. So, if I can just summarise, because I know it's time. To me, the decolonising work it's been a lifetime of what I've thought about. There are a lot of writers who work in this space now. When I first started as a researcher, I felt I was just a single voice. People asked me, why did I write that book? I said, I wrote it because I felt I needed to say these things. Did I know the book would travel? No. Did the publisher know the book would travel? No, they took a punt. That was Z Books. They thought it was interesting and that it, might be interesting to others. Were you the prime audience of that book? Not really. I had a clear focus that I wanted to talk to people who were like me, sitting in a graduate class, who are Indigenous, wondering, where am I in this curriculum? And the only way I could reach them is through people like you, who are teachers, who are academics, who are interested. And it took years, really, for that to happen. I also knew, because I know my own family, they don't buy books, Indigenous books, right? It's only now that our community are starting to buy literature. Why? Because there are Indigenous authors writing, Indigenous poets, playwrights, filmmakers, you name it, it's created an audience. So I had that vision. Did I think the ideas would carry to England? No. And I was asked when I was here earlier, what I thought England could do to decolonise. And I really I have no idea. If you decolonised everything in England, here's my question. What would be left? What would be left? So the question has to be, what will you create? All right? What will you create? Not just what will you take away. And I think that's the task for all of us to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that Professor Goldberg is here somewhere. Yes, but since Linda's come all this way, I know she's not going to mind. I think I know people won't mind. A couple of really quick questions, and then I know that you're going to the welcome reception, and I'm sure these conversations will continue then. Again, we have some people with roving mics. A couple of really quick questions.
I just wanted to say thank you, but also to acknowledge the difficulty of the task, because I tried at the place where I work to start this kind of dialogue, but also to try and put it in practice. And then trying to get a decolonized reading list. And honestly, for the topic I'm working on, I found 5, and one of them had citations which students wouldn't understand because it was in the Hijri thingy. And I felt really upset that something I feel very strongly about is so difficult to achieve. So, you know, if more of us do this, then more of us will be able to access more things. So even if you believed in it, it's not so easy.
That's right.
Professor Linda, thank you so much for your keynote. I'm Director of the Centre for Race Education and Decoloniality at Leeds Beckett University. And my question is, in terms of all the processes that you've described, how do we begin to actually decolonise our minds, those of us who are black and global majority people sitting in this audience who are also researchers, academics and teachers, because I think it needs to begin with us too?
That's a good question. It's also a really hard one, because to do that is often to deal with trauma. The trauma of our people, the trauma of our families, the trauma of our lands. And so that requires, you know, community-type processes where we can do that. And over the years at home, there have been lots of different sort of ways we've tried to organise workshops and communities to kind of understand what happened, because one of the outcomes of those is people get angry and they go out of the room angry and they just want to hurt someone. Well, that's not productive, you know, and that's why the healing part is important. And a lot of the work that I've been doing at home and research with trauma, working with our what we call providers, our health service providers, has been really around strategies for healing and reframing things. So it's not about victimology, it's not about, you know, what are the Olympic sports of trauma and loss, but the focus is on healing. How do we heal ourselves? Firstly, we've got to recognise what happened. We've got to be taken through that in a careful process. We've got to understand what it means to forgive. And the person we most have to forgive often is ourselves, because of the things that we've carried. But we also need a language, a new language for talking about this, because the language that colonised us is the language that gave us the frameworks to make ourselves feel terrible. All right, we need a new language that makes ourselves feel great. And so there are all these processes that I know, you know, not just at home, but a lot of Indigenous communities are very deliberate in the healing aspects, because we've had to do that. But it's also about healing land, right? Healing water, healing nature, because we're all wrapped up in the same system. And then, of course, we can extend it further to healing the economy, but that's another talk.
And I think we've got one last question at the very back there. Hopefully the mic has reached you.
Yeah, thanks again. I was just struck by your description of your experience as a graduate student. And I was thinking about, you were saying part of what we need to do is look at how we train people. So part of me is going, well, how do we decolonise and reimagine the doctorate itself? Because I think it is a highly restrictive piece of work, it's highly individualised, it's mediated through a thesis and a viva, which certain people will thrive within. So just as a thought, how can we decolonise and reimagine the doctorate?
Well, firstly, I think we can. I think there are institutions around the world who are reimagining the doctorate. And what was once a single doctorate of philosophy has been expanded to a range of different doctorates in creative practice, doctorates in professional practice, doctorates in work-based training. So there are these different sort of accreditations in different jurisdictions. In my own institution, we offer 3 kinds of doctorates. I mean, this is the thing about the decolonising, is our people still want to have doctorates, right? So they want that, and they want to know that they've worked hard for it and they deserve it. So they want to struggle a little bit. But they also want to be able to create a doctorate that the community acknowledges. So I know both in Australia and New Zealand there are attempts where the community examine the doctorate. You know, the student, I mean, our communities in this case are very loving, all right, because they've promoted the research, they've worked with the researcher. And I'm actually examining a doctorate right now where the community have had first dibs at assessing. And I'm coming in as an international examiner to do that part of it. So I think there are all these different ways that a doctorate can be imagined, but I think the underpinning work is also important. How are students prepared for a doctorate? What does a master's degree look like now? Because I don't know about the system here, but in our system it's a complete mess. I don't even understand what a master's degree is anymore, because you have this kind of master's, that kind of 180 point to 360 point, a research by thesis only, a professional master's. Oh, it's tiring. And yet when you're asked to examine a thesis by a master's student, do you look at whether it's 60 point, 180 point, 240 point, 360 point? You know, when you're examining it, you tend to think, well, is it a thesis? Does it have a question? Does it do some, you know, have some literature, those sorts of things? So all the way down in our system, we have to be rethinking what it is we're trying to achieve, and are these the best ways to do it?
Maybe we could continue the conversation over. I'm sorry. I think we need to move on because we still have one more speaker. Yeah. Maybe we could ask the question at the welcome reception. Thank you very much, Linda. Yeah.